You ever make a decision so rushed that you don't realize how bad it is until you're knee-deep in it? That was me. My name is Ethan, and this happened when I was a sophomore in college. After my freshman year, I got stuck without a dorm, scrambling for off-campus housing. Long story short, I landed in a co-op house, part of a three-house community on the outskirts of town. It wasn't close to campus, not even a little, but it was cheap and I was out of options. Besides, I had a bike. What's an extra few miles, right? Most of the people there were students like me, young, broke, and just trying to make things work. But there were a few exceptions, and that's where things got weird. At first, the house seemed normal enough. Sure, there were a handful of alumni, a couple of TAs, and some older students finishing their degrees, but there was one person who stood out immediately, an older woman from one of the other houses. She looked like she was in her late 50s, maybe older. Her graying hair was always tied back, and she walked with a noticeable limp, like she had an old back injury. She never spoke much, never even reacted to conversations around her, just this blank, distant expression on her face. At first I figured she had some kind of connection to the university. Former faculty? An alum? No one explained, and I didn't ask. Then one night I saw her do something strange. I was in the common kitchen, which was odd in itself. Each house had its own, so why was she in ours? She wasn't cooking, eating, or talking to anyone. She was just standing there. While the rest of us moved around, cooking, laughing, chatting, she just watched, still, silent, expressionless, like she was waiting for something. That night in the kitchen stuck with me. Something about the way she stood there, silent, watching, it just felt wrong. At first I told myself I was imagining things. She wasn't staring at me specifically, right? That would be ridiculous. But then, I saw her again. I was in my room, working on an assignment, when I happened to glance out the window. She was there, standing in the middle of the street, not on the sidewalk, not moving, just staring. It was late, cold. She wasn't even wearing a jacket. I told myself she was just looking at the house in general, not at me, but it felt personal. And then for some reason I waved at her. The second I did, I regretted it. She didn't wave back. Instead, she jumped up and down like a child who had just been given a surprise, then took off running toward another house. I felt my stomach drop. I hadn't just acknowledged her. I had confirmed that she had been watching me. And worse, now she knew which room was mine. Later that night, I brought it up to one of my housemates. He barely looked up from his laptop before saying, "Yeah, she's just always been here. Ignore her, man. Everyone else does." That didn't sit right with me. I kept asking around, and eventually someone from her house gave me an answer, sort of. She's associated with the university. A little weird, but harmless. No history of violence or anything. I stared at them. That's it? That's all anyone knows? They just shrugged. We don't choose who lives here. That's up to the property manager. It wasn't a great answer, but what could I do? I tried to push it out of my mind, and then it got worse. One night, I stepped out of my room and nearly ran into her. She was right outside my door. I jumped back, heart pounding. It was past midnight. The house was mostly dead. She didn't react. She just turned and walked away, like I was the one intruding on her. I won't go into every weird encounter, but there were more. A lot more. I'd catch her snooping around places she didn't belong, standing in empty hallways, just listening. Then I lost my room key. All three houses had once been a hotel, so each room had its own personal lock and key. Most people just left their doors unlocked, but not me. I couldn't sleep comfortably knowing someone could just walk in. I had a spare key, but still it pissed me off. The last thing I needed was to go get a copy made. And then a few nights later I woke up suddenly. At first I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it. A soft bumping coming from my closet. Every 20 seconds, something shifted behind the door, like something was inside. I don't scare easily, and I sure as hell don't freeze up when I feel threatened. So whatever was in my closet, I was going to handle it. I climbed out of bed slowly, careful not to make a sound. My heart was pounding in my ears. Taking a deep breath, I inched toward the closet, forcing my breathing to stay steady. The bumping sound continued. Something was moving inside. I gripped the handle, counted to 3 in my head, and ripped the door open. I screamed like a madman, because she was in there. The woman. One of my ties was wrapped around her neck, her wide eyes locked onto mine, and in her other hand, a knife. For a split second, neither of us moved. Then, she lunged. I barely had time to react before she came at me. Knife outstretched, her mouth twisting into some silent, unnerving expression. I screamed again, this time, not as a trick. This was pure terror. I grabbed her arm, struggling to keep the blade away. She was small and frail, but she fought like a wild animal, kicking, scratching, biting. We crashed to the floor. I managed to wrench the knife from her grip, pinning her down. She screamed, an awful, blood-curdling sound. I yelled for help. Doors slammed open in the hallway. Footsteps thundered toward me.
Without hesitation, he dropped down, helping me hold her down while someone else grabbed their phone and called the cops.
The rest of the night blurred together. By the time the police arrived, she had stopped struggling. She didn't speak. Not a word. And when the officers searched her pockets, they found my room key. A few weeks later, we finally got answers. She was the property manager's sister, a woman with severe mental health issues. Instead of getting her proper care, the property manager had just shoved her into an empty room, keeping it under wraps. He was arrested for negligence and a laundry list of other charges. And as much as I wanted to blame her, I didn't. I blamed him. She needed help, and instead she had been left to rot in that house. That doesn't change the fact that she tried to kill me. It doesn't change the fact that I could have died that night. And as I get ready to graduate, I know one thing for sure. I'll miss college, but I'll never be able to look back on it without thinking about that night. The girl in the white car. You get used to the rhythm of a quiet neighborhood. That's why, when something is off, you notice. For me, it started with a white convertible. A young guy named Derek had moved into the house across the street a few months ago. Late 20s, flashy car, expensive watch. He looked like he had money to burn. But despite that, he was polite, always waving at me when he left for work. Then came the girl. She was young, blonde, and always dressed like she was stepping onto a magazine cover. At first, I figured she was his girlfriend, especially when I noticed she had her own key to his house. She'd pull up when he wasn't home, let herself in, stay for a bit, then leave. It became a routine, once, twice a week. I didn't think much of it. People date differently these days. Then one afternoon I was tending to my garden when I heard shouting. I looked up. She was furious, throwing her hands in the air, practically spitting her words at him. Derek tried to keep his voice low, but she just got louder. For a second, I thought she was going to hit him. Then, without warning, she stormed to her car, slammed the door, and peeled out of the driveway. Derek just shook his head and went inside. It wasn't my business. Couples fight. But a few days later, I noticed something strange. Her car was back. Derek wasn't home. Not once, not twice, but multiple times. I told my husband James that something didn't sit right. He told me to mind my own business. So I did. Until the night the sirens came. I woke up to flashing lights and the sound of police cars screeching to a stop. James and I rushed outside, joining the neighbors as officers swarmed Derek's house. An ambulance was already in the driveway. And then, I saw her, the girl. Handcuffed, expressionless. She didn't fight, didn't scream, just stared straight ahead as they led her to a patrol car. And then they brought out Derek, on a stretcher. He was a bloody mess. I gasped. We didn't see him again for a week. When he finally came home, James and I walked over. He let us in without hesitation. And that's when we heard the full story. Her name was Erica, and she had planned everything. She wasn't supposed to have a key. She had stolen his spare and made a copy without him knowing. She had been tracking his location through his phone. She had gone through all his things, but worst of all, she had hidden cameras in his bedroom. Every time she went to his house while he was gone, she was replacing the batteries and making sure they were still working. That fight in the driveway, that was Derek trying to break up with her. She refused. He caved, saying they could go on a break. She watched him say it through her cameras. And the next night, she came back with a knife. I won't explain the rest. You already know. Derek barely managed to fight her off. The doctor said if the knife had gone 1 inch deeper, he wouldn't have made it. I still sit on my porch most days, watching the world move around me. But now, I pay closer attention. Because when something feels off, it probably is. Quinn was shaken, that much was clear. Before we left, he sighed and said, I learned my lesson. Never flash your money, especially around the wrong kind of people. Not long after, he packed up and moved. He didn't feel safe in that house anymore. And with his ex having so many friends just like her, he didn't like the idea that they knew where he lived. We never saw him again. I just hope he's doing okay. No one should have to go through something like that, especially someone so young. A new beginning. Or so I thought. When I moved into my new place, all I wanted was a fresh start. I won't get into the details, but let's just say an ex made staying in my old city impossible. I had come into money early in life, made some bad choices, and surrounded myself with the wrong people. Lesson learned. This new neighborhood seemed like a dream. Low crime, quiet, mostly families. The houses were spread far apart, which was part of the appeal. Well, most of them were. My next-door neighbor's house, for some reason, sat unusually close to mine, and it was massive. I remember thinking it could house a family of 10, maybe more. At first, that's exactly what I assumed. A big, bustling family with grandparents and kids running around. I couldn't have been more wrong. I wanted to keep a low profile, but I wasn't about to be rude. I made it a point to introduce myself to everyone in the neighborhood. Almost all of them were parents with young kids, and to be honest, they were a little intimidating. Successful, well-established, and living picture-perfect lives. As a single guy in his late 20s, I wasn't sure how I'd fit in. I saved my next-door neighbor for last, not intentionally. It just worked out that way. By the time I got around to it, I was exhausted from making small talk all day. But I knew if I put it off, I'd probably never do it. So I sucked it up and walked up the driveway. When the door opened, I was caught off guard. Instead of a middle-aged family man, I was looking at a young guy, probably younger than me, with a mullet. Not exactly what I expected. Damon said, "Oh wow, someone born in my decade. What a nice surprise," I laughed. Right? Feels like I'm the odd one out here. I told him how out of place I felt among all the families, and he waved it off. "Damon, don't worry about it. Most people here keep to themselves anyway." That was a relief. He introduced himself as Damon, and casually invited me over for a drink sometime. Half joking, I shrugged and said, "Why not now?" I expected him to laugh and wave me in, but instead he hesitated. His eyes flicked over his shoulder like he was checking something inside. Then he turned back to me, still smiling, but his tone was different. "Fair enough." I asked what he did, just to keep the conversation going. His expression shifted, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. He gave a short laugh and said, "Finance. No elaboration, nothing else." We chatted for a few more minutes, and before I left, he gave me his number. I was excited to have a neighbor my age, but something about him didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was nothing, maybe. But for a guy that chill, living alone in a house that huge, something just felt off. Damon and I lived completely different lives, though in a way we were doing the same thing, keeping to ourselves. The difference? My house was barely half the size of his. I tried reaching out a few times after he gave me his number, hoping to set something up. Every time he'd hit me with the same excuse. "Too busy, man. Sorry." After a while, I gave up. Not in a bitter way, just in a you do you kind of way. I'm not the type to chase after someone who doesn't seem interested. Still, something about him didn't sit right. I never saw anyone come or go from his house. No visitors, no parties, no delivery drivers dropping off takeout. His car never left the driveway. I had no idea how he even got groceries because, as far as I could tell, he never left. Now, before you think I was obsessing over my neighbor, let me explain. I work from home, and my office is on the 3rd floor, overlooking Damon's property. His house was always just there, in my peripheral vision. It was hard not to notice. Then came the night everything changed. It was a Wednesday around 2 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of blaring music. I sleep with my windows open, so it didn't take much to jolt me awake. At first I thought I was dreaming, but the bass was too real, too loud. Curious, I got out of bed and peered out the window. That's when I saw them. 7 or 8 cars lined up in Damon's driveway. So he does have a social life. I'm not the type to complain about noise, and I've been to my fair share of house parties, but in the middle of the week, and this loud, it was over the top. Figuring I'd just ask him to turn it down, I threw on a hoodie and walked over. From the outside, it looked like a full-blown rager. I knocked on the door, no answer. I pulled out my phone, thought about texting him, but decided against it. He'd probably just ignore me. So I knocked again, harder this time. Nothing. I reached for the handle, fully expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. The door swung open. The first thing I saw was a pile of shoes in the foyer, at least 10 pairs, scattered as if people had just kicked them off. But something was off. The house was silent. I stepped inside, expecting to find people laughing, drinking in the living room or kitchen, but there was no one. No bottles, no cups, no jackets draped over chairs, just an empty house. And yet, the music still played. That's when I really listened. It wasn't music at all. It was a recording. A loop of laughter, clinking glasses, muffled voices, a fake party. But that didn't explain the cars or the shoes. There had been people in this house, that much was certain. I should have left right then and there, but I didn't. I had to know. Moving cautiously, I searched the house until I noticed a door left slightly ajar. Something about it made my stomach drop. It led down to the basement. I can't explain how I knew, but whatever was really happening in that house, it was down there. The stairs were steep, the air thick with something stale. The only light came from deeper inside, a faint glow I couldn't quite place. Then I heard it. Beneath the low hum of the recording, another sound crept into focus. A mechanical grinding, heavy and rhythmic, like a buzzsaw chewing through wood, or something worse. I moved closer, and closer. Then I saw the door. The light leaked out from underneath, pulsing slightly as if whatever was behind it was alive. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I reached for the handle, and then... It was a Wednesday around 2 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of blaring music. I sleep with my windows open, so it didn't take much to jolt me awake. At first I thought I was dreaming, but the bass was too real, too loud. Curious, I got out of bed and peered out the window. That's when I saw them. 7 or 8 cars lined up in Damon's driveway. So he does have a social life? I'm not the type to complain about noise, and I've been to my fair share of house parties, but in the middle of the week, and this loud, it was over the top. Figuring I'd just ask him to turn it down, I threw on a hoodie and walked over. From the outside, it looked like a full-blown rager. I knocked on the door. No answer. I pulled out my phone, thought about texting him, but decided against it. He'd probably just ignore me. So I knocked again, harder this time. I reached for the handle, fully expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. The door swung open. The first thing I saw was a pile of shoes in the foyer, at least 10 pairs, scattered as if people had just kicked them off. But something was off. The house was silent. I stepped inside, expecting to find people laughing, drinking in the living room or kitchen. But there was no one. No bottles, no cups, no jackets draped over chairs, just an empty house. And yet, the music still played. That's when I really listened. It wasn't music at all. It was a recording, a loop of laughter, clinking glasses, muffled voices, a fake party. But that didn't explain the cars, or the shoes. There had been people in this house, that much was certain. I should have left right then and there, but I didn't. I had to know. Moving cautiously, I searched the house until I noticed a door left slightly ajar. Something about it made my stomach drop. It led down to the basement. I can't explain how I knew, but whatever was really happening in that house, it was down there. The stairs were steep, the air thick with something stale. The only light came from deeper inside, a faint glow I couldn't quite place. Then I heard it. Beneath the low hum of the recording, another sound crept into focus. A mechanical grinding, heavy and rhythmic, like a buzzsaw chewing through wood, or something worse. I moved closer and closer. Then I saw the door. The light leaked out from underneath, pulsing slightly, as if whatever was behind it was alive. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I reached for the handle, and then... I wasn't supposed to be there, I knew that. But curiosity has a funny way of overriding common sense. And now, standing in the dark, peering through a narrow crack in the door, I saw something that made my stomach twist. There were 3 men inside. They weren't young. Definitely older than Ryan. Heavy-duty work clothes, thick rubber gloves, protective goggles. Their boots clunked softly on the concrete floor. They were staring intently at something just out of my line of sight. I took a slow step forward, straining to see what had them so focused. That's when the smell hit me. Strong, chemical, like bleach or some kind of industrial cleaner. My instinct screamed at me to get out. Something bad had happened here. Trying not to make a sound, I turned, moving carefully toward the stairs. Just as I reached the bottom step, the dim glow behind me shifted. The light had changed. Someone had closed the door. I didn't wait. I bolted, sprinting up the stairs, through the empty house and out the front door. But I didn't go straight home. I cut through the yard, vaulted my own fence, and slipped in through the side entrance, locking it behind me. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would give me away. No one could know I'd been there, especially not Ryan. Up in my office, I crouched beneath the window and peered out toward his house. At first, nothing. Then, a few minutes later, the front door burst open, and a group of men, at least 8, spilled onto the lawn. They scanned the yard, the street, searching for something, for someone, but Ryan wasn't with them. They argued in hushed but aggressive tones. One man shoved another. I thought a fight was about to break out, but then, just as suddenly, they retreated inside. The music stopped. Silence. I stayed at the window, heart still racing, trying to piece together what I had just witnessed. Call the cops? And tell them what? That my neighbor had a weird party with old men in work boots? That the smell of bleach made me uneasy? And what about the shoes? The people inside had all been wearing boots, yet I had seen a pile of different shoes at the entrance earlier. Why? Did they bring extra shoes just to leave them there? I barely slept that night. The next morning I checked outside. Every single car was gone, including Ryan's. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't focus. Every few minutes I found myself glancing at his house. Hours turned into days. No sign of him. The grass in his yard grew wild, packages piled up at his door. It was like he had vanished. I had to know. I started knocking on doors, casually asking my neighbors if they had heard the party that night, but no one remembered any noise, not a single person. Even when I pointed at Ryan's house and described the blaring music, the shouting, they just gave me blank looks. That was months ago. Ryan never came back. His house remains untouched, abandoned. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I'm overthinking. But I can't shake the feeling that something sinister happened that night. And if Ryan ever does return, I don't know if I'll have the guts to ask him what really happened. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The weight of the words felt like a heavy stone pressing on my chest. I quickly closed the notebook, my hands shaking. I had to get out of there. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The weight of the words felt like a heavy stone pressing on my chest. I quickly closed the notebook, my hands shaking. I had to get out of there. I slipped the notebook into my jacket and backed out of the house, heart pounding. As I stepped onto the porch, I looked back one last time. The silence around me was deafening. I had no idea what I had just stumbled into, but one thing was certain. Whatever Damon had been involved in, it was far from ordinary. I had a choice to make: confront him, or walk away and pretend none of this ever happened. But the questions kept haunting me. The party, the strange men, the argument, the notebook. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about Damon anymore. It was about something bigger, something dangerous. I just hoped I wasn't already too deep into it to turn back. I guess we'll see when Damon comes home. Stay tuned.